eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resist. The Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the U.S. found a new solution: to absorb and assimilate them. Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide, disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families.
Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of...
Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them. Too. Adoption was cheaper than running boarding schools. But first, adoption officials had to sell white America on the idea of adopting Native American children. Feature stories like this one in Good Housekeeping. White families wanted Indian adoption. But the problem was, many of these children were not orphans that nobody wanted. They were kids often ripped apart from families that wanted to keep them.
You still will hear stories today.
By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the U.S. government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands. And that was part of the U.S. strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away, a number of U.S. policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away. The whole project was to stimulate the adoption of American Indian children to primarily non-Indian adoptive homes. They claimed it was to promote the adoption of the forgotten child, but it was essentially a continuation of the questionable. Some accounts describe children being taken away for living with too many family members in the same household.
An extended family is a big thing for Native people, and that means being judged for being in a house that's overcrowded.
But it was just one of many in an era of Native American adoptions. Other state agencies and private religious organizations began increasingly making placements for Native American children too.
My mother giving
the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA,
gives tribes a place at the table in court.
States would be required to provide services to families to prevent removal of an Indian child. And in case removal was necessary,
on Tuesday by the Goldwater Institute, arguing that preferences given to American Indian families to adopt Indian children is unconstitutional and discriminates based on race.
It's a way for these industries, these very powerful industries, to try to attack what Indian identity is.
With the authority of the Almighty God, we give, grant, and assign in perpetuity to you and your heirs all the islands and the mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered in the West and South.
Win these new lands and territories for the Catholic Church, and the kind of sweetener for them was that any lands or territories that were held by non-Christians were available for them to claim.
There is no such thing as the law of doctrine of discovery. There is no such thing. He decided it, relied on the doctrine of discovery to come up with these legal principles that Indians never owned their lands. They weren't capable of owning their lands. Modern times, we still have Aboriginal title. It's that right to occupy and use the land. We can't sell it to anybody. We have to get the consent of the Crown or the Canadian government. That's how our law has evolved. It's been on the basis that the discovery gave the discoverer absolute title to our lands, and the Indians were left with nothing but right to occupy and use the land. It has value now because that use and occupation comes with
your idea about papal infallibility. It's really going to call it into question. So I think probably what Pope Francis would prefer to do is what he did with residential schools, to say this was an error, but not necessarily rescind it, because there isn't a way to.
Last year, during a visit to the Canadian Arctic,
Pope Francis apologized to First Nations people for the evil of the country's Catholic residential schools. Those schools became notorious for abuse and even of Canadian Indigenous children as they were forced to assimilate to white Catholic culture. Church doctrine also allowed Portugal and Spain to take territories in Africa and the rest of the Americas.
1455 Papal Bull Romanus Pontifex, it said that the King of Portugal was to go to the western coast of Africa and to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies.
Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlyle model, the U.S. found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some
admissible. The court declared that Chinese citizens could not testify against white defendants, citing similar precedents forbidding testimony by black and Native American individuals. This decision effectively legalized violence. Success. American workers began to see them as a threat. Politicians and labor leaders denounced them for driving down wages, and violence against Chinese individuals became increasingly common. This anti-Chinese sentiment soon...
The tribe also claimed construction had already disrupted some of their sacred sites and burial grounds.
We have a sworn declaration from one of the tribe's cultural experts that describes some of these sites, multiple...
Apply for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. That gets contaminated. They don't have a water supply.
The company building the pipeline said it would be safer than sending oil via trucks or trains.
This pipeline is being built to safety standards that far...
The Tohono O'odham tribe says sacred burial sites were blown up for border wall construction.
You can see the controlled blasts in this video. Now members of the Tohono O'odham tribe are outraged. They're protesting in Ajo, near the Border Patrol station on...
Or desert people. Their 4,000 square mile reservation is sliced by the U.S.-Mexico border. And with more and more militarization, Border Patrol are a constant presence.
Any movement that we made, if we go pick the saguaro cat.
No way. The months of the year was important to know because there were certain ceremonies that could not be done out of season. And then there were certain songs and that could not be sung out of season. It had to be
highlighting important events, influential people, the change of seasons and holidays. In Western culture, we use the Gregorian calendar. And as you'll see in this moment in history, the calendar is massively influenced by Christianity.
We are U.S. citizens, but we're not able to vote for the United States president.
A third of our island is occupied by the U.S. military.
The United States could have made Guam a state at any time. It hasn't.
In part one of the series, I looked at how Guam...
The other John Rolfe. She was captured for the purpose of sexual and economic exploitation, later having a son with Rolfe. When her and Rolfe made it to England, she was poisoned at the age of 22. She never made it home, and her body remains in Europe. While in America, homicide is the third leading cause of death amongst Native girls and women aged 1 to 44. And more than half of Indigenous women experience sexual violence. Even though Native Americans are only 2.5% of the U.S. population, Native women are 10 times more likely to be